Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Craig Palmer. I'm the Sales Director at Hamamatsu Photonics UK Limited. And on behalf of Hamamatsu Photonics, I'd like to welcome you all here today to what will be a really fantastic event. So gas sensing is strategically important for Hamamatsu. It's for our guest speakers as well, and I'm assuming also for you who are joining online. So I would encourage and welcome open discussion between all of us, and please do pose questions at any time during the event using the chat function online. So please don't wait to the end, just pose questions at any time that you have them. So with that, I would like to pass over to Adnan, who's going to introduce our guest speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. So I'm Adnan Quasi. I've been with Hamamatsu Photonics for the last 10 years, working as a sales engineer, and recently joined the ventures team of Hamamatsu. We're looking at interesting technologies for the future. And on that topic of interesting technologies, we have our panel members here today to discuss mid-infrared technologies. So if we could take some time to introduce ourselves. Des, over to you.
My name is Des Gibson. I'm the CEO and founder of Albasense, a relatively new spin-out company from the University of the West of Scotland. We're manufacturing non-dispersive infrared sensors in high volume and really heavily using mid-infrared light source detectors. Basic background, I completed a PhD in thin film optics too many years ago to mention, and then moved into large companies over a period of about 12 years. Pilkington Glass being one, Nikon Precision, Hewlett-Packard. Reached a point in my career where I decided I wanted to do my own thing and not work for large companies. So subsequent to that, set up a series of companies, mainly in optics, thin film optical coatings, set up 2 companies there. Successfully sold one, not successfully developed the other, and then with colleagues set up a company called Gas Sensing Solutions out of Scotland. It's still running. That's producing CO2 sensors, also using mid-infrared light emitting diodes, photodiodes, and then for an easier life, moved from industry into academia later in life, the University of the West of Scotland.
It's easier, Jez.
It hasn't quite worked out that way, Jane. So, because we'd spun out 2 additional companies, one Novasound and one Albasense that I've mentioned as well. So quite a checkered career between different companies, large companies, great for gaining experience, not good if you want to make a decent amount of money, setting up small companies and moving on, developing and then selling, and then a move into academia as a nice coast towards retirement. I recommend it. Recommend it.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'm Jane Hodgkinson. I'm a reader in applied photonics at Cranfield University. Lots of people don't know anything about Cranfield, so I'll just say a little bit. We're a postgraduate only institution and we have our own airport. So that 2 things that make us unique in the UK. I work in the Centre for Engineering Photonics, and our remit is to develop new solutions to challenging measurement problems using light, and we do that across all sorts of applications. So a bit about my career too. My first degree was in physics. I moved to the chemical industry, decided I needed to go and do a PhD at the ORC at the University of Southampton. But I did that PhD in the water industry, developing sensors for contaminants in potable water. When I finished that, I moved to the gas industry, looking at gas detectors for leaks in the distribution system mainly, but all sorts of other things that would crop up. And like Des, I got fed up with working in large companies. So then I moved to Cranfield University, and since I moved there, I set up gas detection labs, and I've been leading a gas detection activity within the Centre for Engineering Photonics. Oh, I also chair the Gas Analysis and Sensing Group, which is a UK forum for analysis of gas, VOCs, particulate, measurement, detection, modelling, standards, you name it. We bring together companies, consultants, academia, government labs, and I think it's one of those unique fora that just really works. So quick plug for them.
Thank you, Jane.
No. My name's Hideaki Page. I'm founder and director of Cytronic Systems Limited. We do contract R&D and bespoke development of gas sensing systems for various clients, have a specialization in quantum cascade lasers, and we're trying to sort of reduce sort of barriers to entry for people using these devices by providing the associated electronics and detection electronics as in sort of a modular format, so people can sort of build up their own system around our sort of spectroscopic engine. My background is in physics, and I did for some years some fundamental research in quantum cascade lasers in Thalys in France. Had some success with that, so that's really my background.
My name is Werner Mentele. I'm a physicist by training. I got a PhD in physical chemistry and have been a professor of biophysics or physical chemistry at different universities in Germany. Among that, from 1997 to 2018, the head of the Biophysics and Medical Physics Institute at Frankfurt University. Our research was mainly on infrared spectroscopics-based sensors. Because that seems so attractive and interesting, we started in 2015 with a startup company called Diamondtech. Diamondtech stands for Diabetes Monitoring Technology and develops sensors in medicine, especially for non-invasive glucose monitoring based on infrared spectroscopy. And when I became emeritus at Frankfurt University in 2018, I went into my company and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Diamondtech.
Thank you very much, everyone. So it's really great to have all of you here participating on this panel. I feel very lucky to be amongst so many physicists as well. And so let's jump into the topics. I want to start with asking you all this question about why mid-infrared. What advantages in your particular area of expertise is mid-infrared technologies opening up the application area for you? So could we start with yourself?
I can start. I think that mid-infrared spectroscopy, whether in gas sensing, whether in soft metal, liquids, sensors for medical purposes, whatever, offers a fantastic selectivity and specificity, which is sort of, you can compare it to mass spectroscopy. You can see molecules, identify molecules, and infrared spectroscopy can also use to quantify molecules for a quantitative measurement. So it may have been a bit underestimated with its potential because the chemists used to do infrared spectroscopy all the time, but they never dealt with the fact that you could also do a quantitative infrared spectroscopy. And they also thought that water and infrared spectroscopy do not go together, which is not true. You can do fantastic infrared spectroscopic measurements on aqueous samples with a lot of water on very complex samples in the medical domain, samples that are tissue samples, for example, cell cultures, proteins, enzymes. Meanwhile, they have been characterized partly by infrared spectroscopy, and there the selectivity pays off and you get an awful lot of information.
Well, for me, I'm more technology led. Obviously, from my background in QCLs, and there seems to be a break in technology between near infrared and mid infrared technology. The science says all the best spectroscopy is in the mid infrared. The strongest spectroscopic absorption lines, the fundamental resonances are based in the mid infrared. But the best technology is near infrared, telecoms, lasers, and such like. So you can get very, very high performance devices. And this mismatch between the technology is limiting sort of applications in a way. And with the advent of new devices like quantum cascade lasers, that allows us to sort of breach that barrier and move towards sort of compact solutions. So the field is open for invention, which is something I very much enjoy. So how can we exploit this emerging technology to generate new applications?
Thank you.
So we start with a position where we want to measure a molecule in a gas, or as Werner does, in aqueous phase or condensed phase. So our starting position is what information does that molecule have for us? And then, as you said, the mid-infrared is this rich source of information that can be used qualitatively and quantitatively. And looking at it with very, very high precision, high resolution, you can get an incredible amount of information content out of it. But that information can also be present in the near infrared. So we tend to be wavelength agnostic when we're starting, and then we look at what can the technology achieve for us in terms of performance. A lot of the time, the mid-infrared wins, but it's a closer argument. It's a closer competition than you might think.
Right.
Sometimes, simply because, as Hideaki said, the technology is so much better in the near infrared, and this has really been driven by telecommunications. So what we're hoping is, with the development of the quantum cascade laser and other technologies, the technology is building on itself again and again and again in the mid-infrared, and the techniques that have been used in the near infrared are being pulled through. At the same time, I think the wavelength reach of communications is extending with the use of hollow core fiber from the near infrared. So we're at a point where we could start to see quite an exciting development in the mid-IR.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Really, the driver, from my point of view, and the companies that we have progressed, is gas detection using primarily non-dispersive infrared. And as Hideaki said, one of the strongest areas for absorption lines, like CO2, methane, which is 45% of the gas detection market, is in the mid-infrared, that 2.5 to 5 micron, methane at 3.3 micron, CO2 at 4.2 micron, a range of other gases. There's huge markets for these that effectively require high volume manufacturing technologies. So mid-infrared is a good region. The technology is now coming through for strong, low cost, mass producible light sources, uncooled, which is obviously key towards the low price. Another aspect is longer wavelength. The optics start to become easier, less scatter, less absorption to some extent, possibility to use reflective optics. So it's, as Jane has said, agnostic to the optic. So it makes it cheaper to make across a range of different wavelengths, and the availability now of detectors as well. So low cost miniaturization, high volume manufacturing, strong absorption lines. So that provides the ready-made fingerprints that we need to detect these various gases. And again, our focus is primarily the high volume, where you're looking at thousands to tens of thousands of sensors per month manufacturing. So you have to think quite differently. Mid-infrared actually fits with that high volume aspect in a number of technology fronts.
It's probably worth saying that the single most commercially successful optical gas sensor is the NDIR CO2 sensor.
Yes,
because
exactly.
it's the only method that really works at the performance that's needed for CO2. If there was a cheaper alternative using a materials-based sensor, that would not have taken off. But
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Another point where the mid-infrared had deficits over many years was understanding the spectra. There was a very crude sort of understanding coming from the old chemist ages. This band is probably a CH band, this is a CN band, and so on. Meanwhile, the molecular dynamic simulations are getting so much better, not only because of computer capacity, but they're getting better because there have been refined methods, and you can calculate the spectra and see minor deviations from that, even as a structural deviation of the molecule that they're analyzing. So I think the understanding of the spectra in the mid-infrared is a lot better. I do not see that progress for the near-infrared, the overtones.
Right.
But for the fundamentals, the range between about 3 to maybe 15 microns, the fundamentals, you see that the spectra are much better understood than 15, 20 years ago. And that makes it even a better tool for analyzing molecules, complex molecules, for example, in life sciences.
I think that's Hideaki, where you've got some really great expertise as well in that.
Well, we've had some success actually in actually simulating what a spectroscopic system would do with a QCL. So taking sort of database values for spectra, we can actually pass sort of knowing the characteristics of the laser, a detector, and the associated electronics, we can say pass numerical photons through a numerical gas and get a response. And we've managed to calculate these responses a year before we built the instrument and found very, very good agreement. So the great thing about this is when you come up to an application, people want to measure a certain gas, or typically in an industrial situation, it's a complex gas full of confusion species and such like. So the question is, can you actually do it? And if you want to invest your time and money into actually producing a system, you have to commit to, you either have to commit to hardware, or if we have success in actually modeling the stuff beforehand, we stand a very good chance of understanding what's happening before you commit to the hardware. We can scope out the problem and make a tailor-made bespoke system.
You find the modeling's very clean, very predictable.
Yeah, right down to the bit values we're coming out the ADC converters. We got very good values.
I sometimes ask myself how people could develop a really sensitive dispersive IR instrument 50 years ago without all these modeling programs. But they did a good. They knew about optics, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, on the topic of optics, then there's also fundamental developments that have been able to facilitate your miniaturization and integration of devices from your side as well in terms of the innovations around optics, right?
Yes, very much complementary to what Hideaki has been saying regarding QCLs is mid-infrared LEDs, which are mass producible because it's a semiconductor process, wafer based, and that's now at a state where there is uncooled performance for both the light sources and also for the detectors. So that's made it commercially realizable in high volume. There's also optics that you can bring in to further improve. So we can use 100-year-old concepts to actually improve very modern 3.5 type technologies. An example that we've been talking about between the panelists is immersion lenses, where we can get factors of 20 improvement for a relatively simple optic built-in. Miniaturization is key. Low power consumption, running from energy harvesting are all key that need mass producible. And again, back to the uncooled, you cannot really have the right cost bracket if you have to cool. So the technology is now available with huge scope to further improve. Get more efficiencies, miniaturization, the integration with the electronics, the packaging as another route to reducing cost, use of optical coatings to narrow the band of the LED to start taking you more towards the QCL performance. So there's huge opportunities to further improve. We're by no means at a limit, and using injection molded optics, which we've been talking about, to get cost reduction, and also the reflective optics aspect means it's much easier to cover a wide range of wavelengths. You don't have to worry about refractive index changes in bulk materials.
So the LEDs are really exciting, and as a measurement scientist, what it's displacing is still a little small filament lamp that costs about $1.
Yes.
And the problem with that is you can't modulate it fast, and when you can't modulate it fast, that limits that changes the noise band that you're in for your detector. You take an LED and you're now modulating in the kilohertz regime potentially, which can be transformational in terms of the noise on the detector. The problem that we see with LEDs, and this is what the problem we need to solve still, I think, is the spectral stability. So as they change in temperature, that spectrum moves around, and in a non-dispersive arrangement, that can cause you a big problem.
And the cost of microcontrollers, you have to calibrate 100% with temperature and the gas concentration level with an LED. But the MCUs are probably $1.50. So, and they've got the processing power with calibration to make those corrections. There's also structures we can bring into the LEDs like resonant cavity, where we take out
to reduce it.
the temperature changes are significantly reduced, and we only have amplitude changes. So again, an example of where there's other technologies we can build in to simplify that. And the cost is a major driver as well. We need to get mass producible semiconductor-based technologies that we can bring into the solid state 3.5 type devices.
And the surface optics that you mentioned, reflective optics, that's the technology that you use to put expensive pralines in a package, because the quality of those molds is by far good enough for infrared mirrors. You have to do is a coating.
So I'd like to move to an opportunity to ask questions from the audience as well. Just another prompt to our audience, please feel free at any point to ask any questions in the chat to our audience. One question from my side. So Des, you were mentioning about how important that optics really is on the LED side. 20 times improvement you're capturing by improving that with the immersion lens. So to our QCL experts as well, I'd like to ask you, how is the optics featuring into difficulties when you're looking at a QCL-based system?
We use presently mirror optics, commercial mirrors, expensive mirrors, which can be changed afterwards to very cheap polymer coated, silver or gold coated mirrors. I think that the entire development has, for the mid-infrared and the QCLs, has to move towards integrated optics. Still, a majority of optical designs for lab instruments or commercial instruments that are not too many is a design with free space optics. And that has a number of disadvantages. For example, if there is gas lines, atmospheric gas lines coming in. So I think that the future lies in waveguide optics,
right?
That are in one piece with the detector and with the source.
Yeah, I think optics is a big headache in the mid-infrared, especially compared to the visible wavelengths. The materials are exotic, the coatings are exotic to make anti-reflection coatings, and they're relatively thick on lenses as well. So to build up a thick layer, say a quarter wavelength, they have a tendency to crack off and things. So the associated cost with that, I typically have a client looking for a solution for something, but there's a price is a concern for it. And the optics actually takes up a significant part of the system cost as well. So that has to be got rid of. The other point is we've got great sources in the QCL. We haven't got the detector's not so brilliant either. So every photon is sort of precious. So we want to use as many of them as possible. And the beam quality of the QCL is quite bad. We have lots of beam divergence, and we need fairly powerful lenses to collect as many photons as possible to make a parallel beam. It can be done, but it can be done with a price. So I think a barrier to sort of moving technology forward is actually to get onto systems where either the source itself has an intrinsically good beam quality, so you can use simpler lenses, or we somehow reduce the cost of the associated optics.
That's really interesting that you say that. And working as part of the venture team, one of the key things that we're looking at is photonic integrated circuits. And I would really love to see mid-infrared photonic integrated circuits targeting this kind of gas sensing application in the future, because then you could really look at these waveguides to facilitate the problems that you're talking about in integration.
I think there would be a huge advantage if you don't have to go all the way to integrating the whole system.
Right.
And in fact, the field of sensors and gas sensing is extremely fragmented. There are loads and loads of different applications. They're all niches. The world is full of niches. And as we were saying, some of those applications can stand, they have the numbers to make a full integrated system worthwhile, but not all of them will. So, I would like to be able to buy a fiber optic pigtailed QCL. Like I can buy in the near infrared, that will have so many advantages. If I buy a mid-infrared QCL. It comes in a box that big once you've put the thermal cooling around it and the heat sink. The beams aren't all coming out in the same place, so every time you buy a laser, you've got to align it from scratch, and every single one has a slightly different alignment. If I can put this now into a pigtail, then I know where my fiber is. I know that the manufacturer has aligned the fiber at the laser end, and all I have to do is I have to deal with something really tiny, and I know where I can put that because I can use conventional.
Jane, sorry.
The beam quality coming out the end of your fiber is much better as well.
Yes, it cleans up the beam. Yeah.
Cleans up beautifully.
It has to do with a general problem of mid-infrared fibers.
Yes.
Which is not yet solved, but it's getting slowly better and better.
Yes.
I mean, the hollow fibers are quite good. The classical fibers with these brittle materials aren't the hit anymore.
Yes.
But you get more and more. I also wait for a QCL with a pigtail, because that would, for a developer, that would be much easier to handle.
So if you're going to do one thing in the silicon on the integrated platform, the pigtail solution, I think, would be it's a first step to the rest that actually we would really value.
Yeah, another aspect is the fusion between the optics and the electronics. So really having surface mount componentry, light source detectors, the waveguide structures using like silicon nitride is getting traction now in the mid-infrared. It can be made with very low loss. Patterning techniques at silicon are very compatible with semiconductor-based processing as well. So there's elements of the technology developing, it's bringing them all together. And Europe is quite a range of programs now to look at that integration, to pull that together. So it's miniaturization, it's bringing the optics, light source detectors compatibility, and LEDs. I'm pitching the LED route here, and detectors. It's a very easy transition to get that onto an electronic board through a surface mount feature, and then integrate. You've got lovely Lambertian outputs that are reproducible, that you can then use other lens structures. We talked about the immersion lens structure to then match that to waveguide structures as well. So huge amounts of work going on around the world in that area. And I think it's just a matter of time. And it's as always, it's market driven.
Yeah. But then you mentioned your experience. You purchase a QCL, and it's a big box of electronics with a thermoelectric cooling, an enormous power consumption. That's simply because people have designed it for military purposes, and or maybe for gas spectroscopy, where the line has to be as sharp as a razor. But if you look for mass applications, that's not relevant anymore. You can have slight shift of the wavelengths. You can go to passive cooling, and everything shrinks down to the size of a fingernail.
In principle, yes. And we don't need the powers really necessarily. You say every photon is precious, but often we don't need the power that some QCLs are putting out.
That was influenced by the original military application of QCLs.
Much better as you can.
Blind the enemy with a rod from the QCL.
And it's causing problems with the packaging, because the laser has to be in a package that big just to handle the power, doesn't it?
Over the past 20 years, all our QCLs had the option to go to 200 milliwatts. Which is sufficient. If you put a match in the beam, the match lights off. Nonsense. For spectroscopy, 2 milliwatt is fine, or 5 maybe.
If you've got long path length cells like a Harriet cell, you've got multiple bounces across. You need a little bit of head power though to get the beam through.
You need a bit of headroom.
So I want to just move in a slightly different direction for the next question. I want to bring this to it's covering a lot of the points that you are already. In terms of us comparing and exploring the different options in terms of the mid-infrared technologies, just bringing it back to maybe one question that sort of triggers some of the similar discussions that we're having now. When you hear this point about disruption or innovation within the mid-infrared, what does it really make you think about currently now in these kind of mid-infrared technologies? Hideaki, you mentioned a little bit about the detector a while ago, and the kind of state that the technology's in. Can you talk a little bit more about?
Well, yeah, for me, we have wonderful lasers, but a laser on its own doesn't do very much. You need a very good detector. And again, coming back to this break in the technology between the near infrared and the mid infrared, the detectivity of mid infrared detectors falls off by orders of magnitude the longer your wavelength you go. There's a wonderful Hamamatsu graph from one of their data sheets showing all the different detectors. And I think this is, you alluded to the point that you have to make a trade-off between effectiveness. So we have weaker absorption lines in the overtone region. You've got a great source, but you lose it all on the detector.
Yes.
So you might as well start with a good laser, good detector, have weaker absorption lines.
Mhm.
Almost gives you the same result in some cases. So it's always a trade-off between two. If the detector technology could be somehow improved, now I don't know if we're...
There's a fundamental limit. There's a fundamental quantum limit
on push the detectors, yes. But I still think there's still some wriggle room, but that's really, I would like to see really good detectors at some point. No.
There's quantum technology coming through in the near infrared.
So, for example,
detectors with
simpler ones. Hamamatsu have these stacked photodiodes all in series, and they're sort of emulating pyroelectric detectors. So pyroelectric detectors have quite good detectivity, but they're generally slow because they're thermal. But this is a electronic device that can have similar sort of output.
But Jane, you were mentioning there are some